We're going to discuss this now with Antony Loewenstein in Sydney, Australia. He's a Middle East affairs analyst and author of the Palestine Laboratory. Antony, it's always good to have you on TRT World. What do you think the sticking points are here for Israel and Hamas? Because for days now we've been hearing about this possible deal, everyone hoping that there will be a final agreement here.
Well, the short answer is that Hamas has said for a long time, and of course this current deal apparently is about to be presented to Hamas, but the sticking point for a long time has been that Israel's not willing to have a permanent ceasefire, which is what Hamas demands. In other words, there's a temporary reprieve, 6 weeks, 2 months, hostages get exchanged, the hostages in Gaza go home back to Israel, and a number of Palestinians, which we don't hear so much about, but should, in Israeli jails, many of whom should not be there, who are frankly hostages as well in various different ways, will also get released. But the sticking point is Hamas essentially wants to still have some kind of control over Gaza, and Israel does not accept that, and nor, frankly, does the US or many Western powers. So that's a sticking point. And the second issue I would argue is that your report just touched on this, but there's actually huge pressure on Israel at the moment internally to continue the war. Yes, the hostages certainly a key political point on Netanyahu, but the vast majority of Israelis, according to polls, want the war to continue. There is no serious appetite in Israel to end the war. Yes, to get the hostages home, but as that woman just said a minute ago, whose relative is in Gaza, get our hostages home and do what you want to Gaza. Now, what does that mean? It means continue to level the place, which is what Israel's been doing. So they may end up nutting out a deal in the coming weeks, and I hope that they do. But this does not solve the ultimate problem. Will Hamas still have some control over Gaza at the end of this?
Well, that is a major question that it's not just Israel looking at, but many countries around the world wondering what is going to happen in a post-war Gaza. At this point, though, can Israel or Hamas really afford not to agree to a deal given the horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza, the rising daily death toll, as well as the pressure that Netanyahu is facing? Even if most of the Israeli public supports an ongoing war, he's facing pressure internationally and even within his own war cabinet.
I mean, I'd be pretty skeptical, frankly, of how much pressure Israel's under. I mean, yes, of course, there are calls by Arab states, by European leaders, by the US to temper the war. But let's be clear, the vast majority of Western countries are not calling for a ceasefire. They're not. They have not for nearly 5 months. Some Arab states are, but the vast majority of the West are not calling for that, have not called for that, refuse to call for that, which is frankly outrageous, which the only outcome of that is that they therefore accept the Israeli argument. They might not like Netanyahu as a leader, and increasingly Israelis don't like him either. Most polls suggest if there was an election tomorrow, he would lose in a landslide. But the fact is that there's no, I would argue, enough pressure on Israel to end this, because ultimately their goal here, apparently, and this has been made clear by various government ministers, even in the last few days, you have senior Israeli government ministers attending a major conference in Israel, talking about reoccupying Gaza, building settlements in Gaza. This is not some fringe movement. These are people directly in the Israeli cabinet, key allies of Netanyahu. That is not saying every Israeli agrees with that vision, they don't, but many do. And that is frankly a sticking point, because you have Israelis and settlers who are talking about leading convoys into Gaza to begin settlement building as soon as possible. Now, obviously, Hamas, just briefly, has its own pressures. Clearly, it's feeling military pressure. There'll be pressure from Arab states, including Qatar, to somehow agree to this deal. But I think their goal would be to maintain some kind of control over Gaza, which I'm skeptical about will be accepted by Israel or, frankly, much of the West.
Certainly will be interesting to see what happens with this deal in the coming days. Antony Loewenstein in Sydney, Australia, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.